In the wake of two deadly crashes involving its 737 MAX jets, Boeing faces dozens of lawsuits. In the past several months, we've gathered a steady flow of new information showing the company didn't tell pilots about the automated system that seems to have caused the crashes, that the recovery procedure designed to correct for a malfunction may not have been enough, that Boeing provided the FAA with bad information about how much control that system could have over the plane, and that the FAA didn't test the system. Now, almost 350 people are dead. 189 on Lion Air Flight 610, which crashed last October. 157 on Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, which crashed in March. Their families suing the plane maker. One of the lawyers representing victims' families is a man by the name of Brian Kabateck. His clients are all Indonesian families. Their loved ones died on Lion Air 610. I sat down with Kabateck this weekend in Los Angeles. Kabateck accuses Boeing of withholding information about its jets and is trying to ensure his clients have a right to sue the company. Some Lion Air 610 families signed a form potentially releasing Lion Air of liability in exchange for compensation. Kabateck says he's working to ensure that release doesn't also apply to Boeing. Now, most of his clients never signed the form, and they're moving forward with a lawsuit. Kabateck filed that suit in Chicago, where Boeing is headquartered, just a couple of blocks from where I'm sitting now. But now Boeing is apparently going to try to move the case to Indonesia. Boeing says for the convenience of victims' families. A court has given the company until the middle of next month to declare its intent to move the case. Kabateck says Boeing is trying to escape a robust legal process here in the U.S. He says Indonesian courts oversee a drawn-out process and don't assign punitive damages. He explained.
I think it would probably benefit Boeing in three critical ways. One is I think that they're confident that the economic damages, of the economic losses, as well as the compensatory losses for the loss of a loved one, are going to be kept low by a court in Indonesia. I think they feel rather confident that they'll be able to delay the case for a long period of time if it's in Indonesia, because the courts are apparently very slow, much slower than our courts, much slower than our judge, who has indicated that he wants to move the case along. And the final reason is really there's no punitive damages in Indonesia. And punitive damages aren't designed to compensate anybody. They're designed to punish the wrongdoer. And in this case, Boeing, we believe, should be subjected to punitive damages because of what they did in connection, or what they didn't do in connection, with these aircraft.
Sunday, the day before I sat down with Brian Kabateck, Boeing made an admission. It knew, over a year before Lion Air Flight 610 crashed, that an alert in the cockpit having to do with the sensors that apparently went awry wasn't working. In order to understand all of this, let me explain how the system that went wrong works. There are two sensors on the front of the 737 MAX. They are called angle of attack sensors, or AOA sensors for short. They measure the angle at which the nose of the plane is pointed into the sky. They send that information back to a computerized system called MCAS. If just one of those sensors says the pitch of the nose's plane is too high, the MCAS will trigger using that horizontal stabilizer at the back and push the nose of the plane down. But if that sensor is wrong, the MCAS pushes the nose down anyway, and that causes a nosedive. That is what's suspected of happening on Lion Air 610 and Ethiopian 302, based on preliminary findings. Now, in an update to the MAX, Boeing says the MCAS will rely on readings from both of those sensors. If they disagree by a certain margin, MCAS will not trigger at all. But should the pilots know if those AOA sensors on the nose of the plane aren't reading the same information about how high the nose is pitched into the air? Boeing had indicated that if those sensors disagreed, a warning would pop up in the cockpit to tell pilots. That warning is called AOA disagree. Pretty self-explanatory, right? Again, Boeing indicated it was standard in all MAX jets. Well, Sunday, Boeing admitted it wasn't. It would only work if airlines had opted for another feature: angle of attack sensor information gauges, ones that tell the pilots what information those sensors are actually sending back to the computer. If airlines didn't add on that extra feature, the AOA disagree alert wouldn't work. Boeing knew that back in 2017 and didn't do anything about it. I read part of Boeing's statement to Brian during our interview Monday morning.
They could have done something to make the plane more safe, and they didn't, and then they tried to monetize that kind of safety through an upgrade, much like going to buy a car and whether you want the really good stereo speakers or the really bad stereo speakers. But it's not a stereo speaker. This is something that had to do with people's safety. They didn't advise about it. And then the ultimate fact that they knew about this in 2017, a year before my client's family members perished, is rather outrageous. So if it's found to be that was a substantial factor here, and that if that had been either advised or added as not an upgrade, that these people would be alive today, that's outrageous, and that's one of the reasons why there are punitive damages.
Boeing said on March 11th, the day after the Ethiopian crash, that their flight operations manual already outlines an existing procedure to safely handle the unlikely event of erroneous data coming from an AOA sensor. And they added that a pilot can always override the computer with electric or manual trim. Was that a misleading statement for them to make because they're talking about what the FOM says on March 11th, whereas the pilots on Lion Air Flight 610 might not have known about it?
Right, I think it is misleading. And I think it's misleading because we also know that both sets of pilots, at least from what we've heard from the voice recorder, were trying what they could to look in the manual and to figure out what to do with this problem, and they weren't able to readily find it.
But they already knew about runaway stabilizer, which is what's happening when the MCAS gets an erroneous AOA input and starts putting the nose of the plane down. Effectively, what the plane is doing is runaway stabilizer, and the pilots already know how to handle that. So why would they need sort of redundant instruction on how to handle that?
I mean, the question is, did they know? And did they know what they were doing? And did they know how to operate it based upon faulty information that they may have been given?
The movement of the plane, though, that's happening is something they're already trained on, right?
Right, but they're trained on it based upon the older version of the 737 before the MAX, the 800 before the MAX. And what we've heard, at least anecdotally, is that this evidence was, or this information was being given to them based upon the old aircraft, and it just didn't work based upon the new aircraft.
Dennis Muhlenberg has characterized the AOA problem or the lack of information about what AOA sensors are doing as not a safety issue. What's your reaction to that characterization?
There's probably 350 families that disagree with him.
They've also been lawyering up. They have this new created position. They've elevated their general counsel to a position that's just going to focus on these two crashes.
Retired federal district court or federal court of appeal judge, right? That's who they've taken and put into a very specific position to deal with these issues.
He's got a lot of legal credibility.
Yes, he does.
Does that concern you at all?
No, I'm not concerned because I think the justice system's fair, and I think that we have a fair opportunity to have our case heard. But it shows you the direction that Boeing's moving in, and this is the direction now of hunkering down and deciding that they're going to fight and deciding they're going to do everything they can to fight, which I think is kind of shameful because the initial conversation that came out of Boeing was, it looks like we made a mistake, it looks like we did some things wrong here, and we want to make it right. And now they've changed their tune, and they're looking at this as, what defense can we build up? How can we send these cases to whether it be Ethiopia or Indonesia? And they're also one factor that they have to consider and people have to think about, which is these are obviously very substantial wrongful death claims. But what about the claims from Lion Air and from Ethiopia for the lost aircraft? What about the claims from every single one of these airlines? Take Southwest, for example, who I believe was their largest purchaser. What about their claims for aircraft sitting on a tarmac somewhere in Arizona that they can't fly? And who knows when they're going to be able to fly? This is going to be billions of dollars in claims. Forget the wrongful death cases. What about those cases? So you can see why they're circling the wagons.
Back with part two of our interview with Brian Kabateck, an LA lawyer suing Boeing over the crash of Lion Air 610 last fall. He's fighting to keep Boeing from moving that case to Indonesia, where he fears lower court damages would mean Boeing wouldn't pay for wrongdoing. In this second part of the interview, I began by asking him if failed oversight means more people should feel the heat. Do you think that there's any fault on the part of the FAA here?
It's possible.
Were they negligent?
It's possible. And the reason I say that is because I'm very concerned by the closeness of Boeing with the FAA. I'm concerned with the rush to get this aircraft out. And I'm concerned with the amount of data that we've heard, as well as the complaints, and at least the whistleblower information that we've had, where people were saying, hey, there's problems with this aircraft. Now, whether that whistleblower information was directly related to this cause, the cause of these crashes, we don't know. But what we do know is that people were saying things to the FAA, and it looks like the FAA was turning a blind eye. Are they legally liable? Well, we're going to find out. And we're going to find out whether or not the FAA has crawled into bed with Boeing, and that's very, very disturbing.
So might you also bring suit against the FAA?
Yes.
Are you actively working on that?
Yes.
Will you?
Likely.
What part needs to change about how the FAA does their work?
I think that the FAA needs to make certain that there's a steel wall between them and US-based aircraft manufacturers.
Do you trust that they'll be able to put up a wall like that on their own?
Today, I do not. Today, I'm concerned that given the current state of the administration's likelihood to support business, I'm very concerned that the interest of promoting U.S. business is outweighing public safety.
What's the solution for that? Is it legislation from Capitol Hill? Is it an international body of some sort that can oversee the FAA?
Yeah, I've actually considered that. I think that legislation from Congress would go a long way. Whether you can get something passed in this Congress is a big question. I think that an international body of people who are truly independent, including the notion that maybe NASA could take a role in this as they have in the past, to look at whether or not the industry is behaving appropriately and whether or not there's concerns before aircraft are given a green light and allowed to, become airborne, would be going a long way towards doing something like this.
You mention sort of the interconnectedness of the FAA and business. The U.S. is host to one of two giants on the international stage when it comes to aircraft purchases. Right. Doing significant damage to Boeing could do significant damage to the U.S. economy on a global scale. So does that concern you at all? I mean, you say the justice system is fair, but is there an interest in protecting Boeing's business a little bit?
Well, I think that we have to balance the protecting of business with protecting the public. And no one wants aircraft in the air that's dangerous and that's likely to have another accident and kill more people. And people also, I think the U.S. public deserves, and I think the international public deserves, knowing that the aircraft they get on is safe. Because every single day, millions of people get on airplanes, right? And so if what we're talking about here is protecting the economy, maybe one of the best ways to protect the economy is make sure that there's worldwide confidence in the aircraft that Boeing put out.
Do you ever see the MAX flying again and people feeling good about getting on one?
Oh, I think so.
What would it take before that's the case?
I think they have to overhaul all these safety measures in the MAX. I think they have to show to the public that the aircraft is safe by doing a number of flights and showing that they're working. I think they have to, frankly, I think they have to take ownership of this problem and say they've corrected it and they made it right with the families, and they're not going to let this happen again. And I think it takes time.
Do heads have to roll at Boeing for that confidence to come back?
Maybe. Maybe. All that happens when Boeing draws this out and has these motions and kicks this down the road, all that happens is that you cause the families more grief and more agony, because nothing helps people get past this to come to resolution with something like this.
Surely Boeing considers that, though. I mean, that's not, these people who lead Boeing aren't robotic monsters. I mean, they've got to think about those families. Do you think there's any movement on their side that would suggest that they are trying to be humane about the way they handle it?
It's hard for me to agree with that statement that they're, not monsters here, because they can be humane. I get that they have stockholders. I get that they have a product that they have to protect and jobs and all that kind of stuff. But given the facts and circumstances here, this is crying out for some kind of an early resolution, because I don't think that if I were running Boeing's legal department, and I'm clearly not, but if I was, I would be saying, let's go to these families early and sit down with as many of them as we possibly can and try to put this behind them.
Have you ever seen anything on this scale? You say you've sued a lot of corporations who have liability.
I have never, in my career, 30 years, seen anything quite like this.
What makes it so different? Is it the scale of the tragedy? Is it the way that Boeing is handling it? Is it both?
Well, I think you could start with the fact that brand new aircraft don't fall out of the sky, not once but twice in a relatively short period of time. That's stunning in and of itself. I've never had a case where so many people in the press are helping me do my job by digging and finding more information, and it seems like an unbelievable fountain of information that keeps coming out on almost a daily basis. More information coming out. Everything that I see here just strikes me as one of the most interesting cases as a lawyer, but also one of the most obvious cases. This is one of those cases where it just stuns me, the amount of evidence about their life.
So then if it's so obvious and it's so egregious and the people who run Boeing may not be monsters in your view, why shouldn't heads roll?
Why shouldn't heads roll, and why shouldn't they try to settle this case early? Or even if you don't roll heads, at least admit responsibility, don't try to walk it back, and try to come up with some solution now for these people.
Boeing did not respond to a request for comment.